Hey everybody, here is a tutorial on setting up Vectorworks and a new Vectorworks file to do work on theater design. Here we go. So when you open Vectorworks, we're going to do everything, even though we may have already covered some of it in person in class, just so it's all in one place. Start out by going to the Tools menu. Make sure you're in the Spotlight workspace, so all the way down to the bottom menu, expand that, make sure Spotlight is checked off. That gives you some theater-specific tool sets that you won't see otherwise in your tool palettes. Then go up one spot to Options and click Vectorworks Preferences. That gets you here. The main thing I really recommend you do in this menu is uncheck offset duplications. The default in Vectorworks is to have this checked off. If you have it checked off, all of the things I show you for using the duplicate and move commands to streamline your process won't work for you, and it'll be really frustrating. Uncheck that. Pretty much everything else you can just experiment with if you want to and see what it does. There's a lot of different functionality you can tweak from this menu to make Vectorworks behave just the way you want. But that's enough for now. Say OK. Now let's go to the File menu. I'm going to click New to start a new file. Yes, I want to create a blank document. Say OK. And here's Vectorworks' default blank document. So we'll go to File menu, down to Document Settings, and let's do Document Preferences first. So in the going left to right here in the Display tab, again, things that you can change to make Vectorworks behave the way you prefer. The defaults I've never had any big problems with personally. The Dimensions tab is where we want to spend most of our time here. In the Dimensions tab, leave all of these defaults the way they are. So Vectorworks will default, I believe, to have all three of these checked off. The dimension/thickness is fine. In the dimension standard area, click Custom. And then say New. And we're going to make a theater-specific drafting standard for us to follow for our dimensions. So I usually will call this USITT because that's the drafting standard that we use in theatrical drafting. That's the United States Institute of Theater Technology. Say OK. And then it appears in the menu of custom dimension standards that you have, and with it highlighted, I'll say Edit. And that gets me here. So I can change all of the attributes down to a pretty granular level for how my dimensions will render when I use the dimension tool in my file. Things we want to change from default are, I prefer to have this option here, the distance from witness lines to dimension line, how far they extend. I like to have that be half as big, because I think it's just a little too ridiculously long. So 0.0625, just like the bottom field here, works well. Whoops, shouldn't have hit enter. Everything else around here in the top section is kind of okay. We want witness lines to remain checked off. We do not want to check off fixed witness line length. I think most of the time you'll get the best performance and have to change the least as you work if you check off dimensions always inside. So let's do that. And then all of the linear markers should be some form of an arrow, a filled in arrow ideally. I prefer this one personally, so that's what I always set mine to. All three of these. Make them the same filled in arrow. Everything else is fine here down until we get to text style. And let's just pick a style so that our dimensions are a good size and font to start with. Dimensions 10 point is a good starting point. Usually 10 point font works well. 12 is almost always too big. Sometimes you have to go down to 8. 10's a good starting point. Say OK. and say OK again. And then in the Dimension Standard drop-down menu now, in Document Preferences, we should be able to find USITT. Click on that so that it's selected, and this means that this is the default dimension standard Vectorworks will use, so that's what you want. And everything else is fine here. Let's say OK. And there's one more thing we have to do to tweak the dimensions to look just the way we want. We're going back to the File menu, and back to Document Settings, and now to Units. And in this window, the default tab that pops up is Dimensions, and this is what we want to work with. Everything's fine here down to the point where we have the fractional display for dimensions options. Let's choose the middle option. It's a good compromise between readability, because it's a bigger font than this option, and size, how much space it takes up on the page. So the option on the left takes up a lot more page width, and that can be problematic sometimes. So this one is nice and compact, and it's still readable. I like it the most. Fractional precision should be way more than 1/8 of an inch. My thing is, make it 1/64th, the smallest or most precise rounding precision you can have, so that you can always tell if you're drawing things not quite accurately. In reality, in a scene shop, we are rarely worrying about measuring anything or cutting anything more precisely than within a 1/16th of an inch. But 1/64th is nice because it always tells you if you are maybe not being as accurate with maybe snapping and so forth. So it's good to help you train yourself, and it also prevents mistakes. Everything else looks fine here. Let's say OK. Alright, so now we're ready, except if you like, now if I zoom out, you see right now I have the default page size, which is going to be typically an 8.5 by 11, and it's in portrait vertical orientation. That's rarely the best thing to do, so I will typically right away go into the File menu and go to Page Setup and just kind of guess at what size sheet I'm going to need to print the plan on, the thing I'm about to draw, and I'll enter that here. We can always change it later. If you look at my video on viewports and sheet layers, I show you how right there. But let's go to Printer Setup, and I'm just going to pick, come on, Printer Setup, there we go. I'm going to say Landscape Orientation first, and then in size, I think I'm going to pick Arch C this time. So common size for working drawings that I do, it might be tabloid, particularly because that's what the printer in Watson will print. But I'm going to do Arch C this time. It's like a bigger architectural size sheet that designers' drawings often come on. And I'll say OK, and OK again. And you see my default page boundary has turned into, whoops, this larger sheet. So now that gives me a visual reference for how I might want to lay out my drawing as I'm doing it on the design layer, and it'll cause me to have to do less cleanup when I get to the viewport and sheet layer phase, when I'm getting ready to print or export a final PDF version of my drawing. So one last thing is, let's make sure we have all the palettes showing that you'll need to do your work. Go to the Window menu, and down to Palettes. And here are the things you definitely want, followed by some things you might want. You definitely want Attributes. You definitely want Object Info. You definitely want Navigation. And Basic and Tool Sets. Other things you might want are, you might want Resource Manager, especially if you're doing lighting design. That gives you access to the libraries of ready-made 3D symbols, including lighting fixtures for the stage, things like that. Typically, for making a working drawing for scene design, I don't have it showing. You might also want snapping. I'll check it off. I typically just open this up once and check off all the options I want. So I typically, unless I'm experiencing some problems with my cursor snapping to too much stuff, I'll just have everything everything selected here. Then I'll close it, get it out of the way. Attributes, I like to have the collapse when my mouse isn't over it option, auto hide, and put my tool sets over here, my basic palette and my tool sets palette, object info on top of navigation on the right side of my screen. That's how I usually lay things out. So if you make yours like mine, it might help you find things a little quicker as you're watching my videos and following my mouse cursor around.